Okay, numbers are leveling out, so I think we'll begin. Welcome everybody to the SPF UK Climate Resilience Programme webinar series. This is actually the final lecture in the series, so it's great to see so many people joining. My name is Jason Lowe. I work very closely with the resilience champions, Kate and Suraj. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So today we're covering the topic of high impact scenarios with a focus on the UK. This is a topic that a range of policymakers, practitioners have been raising increasingly over recent times, and it's an area where I think the science research has been developing at quite a rapid pace. So we're going to hear about the production of a new set of scenarios. Professor Nigel Arnell from the University of Reading will be talking us through the project he's been running, the process he's been using to produce these scenarios, and hopefully showing us some of the scenario thinking from that. Dr. Mike Steele works at the Environment Agency. He'll be our respondent today, and he'll be talking about what having this type of scenario means in practice in the real world, and how it relates to the types of decisions that he needs to think about when considering long-term investment scenarios. As usual, we'll have a Q&A to follow. Put your questions into the Q&A box. We'll use the chat for dealing with any problems that people might be having, for instance, around the IT. Next slide, please. In terms of how to engage, presentations first, then the QA and discussion. Post the questions in the Q&A box. And I think the really important bit is often we get lots of questions that are quite similar. So have a read through of the questions first and upvote your favorites if there's something on the general area that you were thinking of adding to it. We'll keep everybody muted just because there's so many people on the call now. But if it's appropriate, we'll enable you to speak in the question session. The webinar audio and the slides will be shared after the event. So if you're watching this this later, you'll be aware that you can access, for instance, via the YouTube channel. Technical problems in the chat, and hopefully you will have all seen the record notice that appeared on the screen. So the seminar is being recorded. Next slide, please. Just a couple of items of program news today. So the first one is to draw your attention to a new round of UKRI policy fellowships for 2023. The scheme has a closing date for applications of the 20th of April. And these are designed to enable researchers to work much closer with government departments. It's part of the What Works Network Centre. It's possible to put a number of fellowship applications in around different subject areas, but some departments are looking specifically for climate related content. We've listed a few here. Susie will place links in the chat as we go through, but you can also Google UKRI policy fellowships. It was the first link that came up when I looked at that. Hopefully that will be relevant to some people listening. Next slide, please. So as we near the end of the UKCR programme, we have the final conference coming up on the 8th and 9th of March in London. The first day is focusing more on the scientific results and the learning. The second day is focusing more on policy and practice and pulling through the outputs of the programme and thinking about the lessons we've learned. Hopefully we'll see some of you at that conference, but material from the conference will be available afterwards as well, including the Palgrave pivot and the insight articles that describe work across the programme. There are a series of sessions. These include looking at improved understanding of climate hazard, improved climate risk capability, managing climate-related risks through adaptation, co-producing climate services, and we'll also talk about, but there'll be opportunities for networking. If we could have the next slide, please. On day 2, we'll be thinking more about the National Adaptation Programme, and there'll be a series of panel discussions covering many of the topics that we started to explore on the first day. That will be followed by a networking lunch. Full details online, there's a link here, but you can also find these on the UKCR website. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to Nigel. As a reminder, when we started this webinar series, Nigel actually gave one of the first of the webinars, and now he's actually giving the last one. So it's bringing a degree of symmetry. So Nigel, over to you for your talk.
Right, thanks so much, Jason. And I'm just about to share my screen.
We can see that now.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And thanks again for the opportunity to talk about some work we've been doing on high impact scenarios. And it is very nice to sort of be at the end as well as the beginning of the climate resilience program. Right, I'll turn my camera off now. Okay, right. So my name's Nigel Arnell from the University of Reading. And as I say, I'm leading this project funded through the climate resilience program with colleagues in the Department of Meteorology, Ed Hawkins, Len Shaffrey, Ted Shepherd and Andy Turner, and with Ivan Haig from the University of Southampton. So I'm going to be talking about the work we've been doing to construct high impact scenarios, primarily looking at the approaches, the methods we're using, rather than describing exactly what these scenarios are going to be in numerical terms. So I want to cover 4 things in varying levels of detail. I want to just go over why we're interested in high impact scenarios and why I think they're going to be useful. I'm going to talk about some of the key concepts behind the way we've constructed these scenarios, because it's really important to understand where they've come from. I'm going to give an overview of the scenarios, zooming in on a couple of them as an illustration. Oh, God, Bennett. And then finish with a couple of reflections on their potential use and interpretation. So why are we interested in high impact scenarios? There are 2 main reasons. One is at the highest level to try and inform climate mitigation policy. So essentially saying what's the worst that can happen if we don't reduce emissions. And this is the concept of tipping points really comes in. It's really high profile. It's the idea that there's some really big nasty things that might happen to the climate system if we don't reduce emissions. So this concept of being concerned about tipping points as high impact scenarios is primarily around informing climate mitigation policy. The big questions about do we need to reduce emissions and by how much? But we also want information on high impact scenarios if we're trying to inform adaptation and resilience policy. Essentially, we need to get some idea of what's the worst that we need to plan for. Before March 2020, people weren't really too concerned broadly about worst case scenarios. And since March 2020 with COVID, we've heard a lot more about planning for the worst case, about planning for extremes and so on. So the profile and attention given to top end, high end scenarios has really increased enormously over the last 2 or 3 years. And this, to a certain extent, is reflected in developing principles for adaptation that the Committee on Climate Change produced. This is from 2021. I'm not going to go into all the principles in any detail, but it's worth pointing out that one of the principles is to seek to adapt to 2 and assess the risks for 4. This is implicitly by the end of the century. But there's also a principle is to prepare for the unpredictable extremes. It's expect the unexpected. It's being clear that we do need to think about things that might be outside the range that we might conventionally be thinking about when concerned with climate change. And there's a bit more specific, some more specific requirements and guidance in various bits of guidance. The supplementary Green Book guidance on accounting for the effects of climate change from DEFRA explains that planning for more extreme change is likely to be appropriate in certain circumstances, where there are high vulnerabilities and low risk tolerance and long planning cycles, for example. So the Green Book guidance says think about things outside the conventional range. The flood guidance for England and also similarly for Wales and Scotland advocate using what's called a credible maximum scenario for nationally significant infrastructure projects. And there are some specific definitions of what those credible maximum scenarios could be. The National Policy Statement for Energy says that critical features of the design of new infrastructure should be resilient to credible maximum scenarios. So there's quite a lot out there encouraging us to think about extreme, high, credible maximum scenarios. The complication is that there's quite a lot of variability across sectors and within sectors, between different organizations within sector, in what is meant by worst case or central case scenarios. There's quite a large amount of variability. And more generally, the House of Lords Select Committee on Risk Assessment and Risk Planning last year produced a report, and one of its conclusions is that we tend to have a bias against low likelihood, high impact risks. So there's quite a big sort of agenda for understanding what these risks might be. One of the complications is that there are lots of interpretations of what we mean by high impact. So I'm going to use the term quite loosely at the moment. I've got it in quotes here, but we could often see them described as worst cases, or very specific instance, reasonable worst case scenarios. Sometimes they're described as low likelihood, high impact outcomes. And that in fact is one of the terms that's used in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's described in the IPCC glossary. Sometimes we hear them described as high impact, low likelihood events, or HILs. We may see them called H++ scenarios, that based on some work that was led by Jason, amongst others, several years ago. Or from the business side, we may see them described as things like black swans, surprises. So there's quite a lot of interpretation about what is meant by high impact. And often when I talk about high impact, I put it in quotes, in air quotes, if you like. And what I'm basically defining as a high impact scenario as something that is plausible. It could plausibly happen. It's not the worst that could plausibly happen. In many senses, the worst that could plausibly happen would be something that would be completely existential. So there's no point planning for it. So it's going to be plausibly likely. It could happen, could feasibly happen, but it's not going to be so devastating that if it does, then game's over. But it's important to emphasize that these high impact, low likelihood events cannot be defined statistically or probabilistically. We can't say, okay, the 1 in 10,000 year event is the high impact, low likelihood scenario. We can't do that because we cannot know the probabilities associated with these sorts of potential scenarios and stories. And that's why I've shown the cover of John Kay and Mervyn King's book on radical uncertainty. It points out that there are some things we just cannot know, and to attempt to describe them statistically is fruitless and challenging. And if you can't do it, and trying to do it will be wrong. So these high impact scenarios are plausibly extreme. So the key point is about being plausible. They've got to have some credibility behind them. A bit more detail on what we mean by the high impact scenario or story or whatever. And we're distinguishing between scenarios that are caused by a high impact driver, something that is, I'm saying here, is outside the range of what we conventionally use. You'll notice I'm being vague about what we mean by conventional at the moment. So we may have a high impact scenario driven by something out of the normal, out of what we usually expect or what we typically expect, an unusual driver. Or we may find that we get a high impact scenario because the system is responding much more extreme way than we anticipated. And I'm interpreting that here as a climate system response outside the range projected by most, not necessarily all, but most climate models. So we can get a high impact scenario caused by an unusual driver or an unusual response. Both of them will generate consequences across the UK, which is what we're primarily interested in here. They'll generate thermodynamic consequences, that's the higher temperature, higher rainfall in winter particularly, but they'll also have the potential to generate what we call dynamic changes, so changes to weather patterns and circulation regimes and so on. So they each of these manifest themselves at the end of the day in thermodynamic and dynamic changes to the weather that is impacting the UK. So what do we mean by conventional scenarios? We're very fortunate in the UK to have the UK CP18 climate projections, and we often use those to characterize how we think climate is going to be changing across the UK. And I've shown here for 3 regions just an illustration of change in winter temperature and change in summer temperature, change in winter and change in summer rainfall. And from the sort of the strand of projections that people most frequently use in practice. This or the regional strand, they're very, very similar in practice. And we tend to get larger increases in temperature in summer than we do in winter. And we tend to get, particularly in the south and east, wetter winters and drier summers, less likely to get drier summers further north. So that's the sort of overall picture we have of change in UK climate. And we also get change in the weather patterns that we might that affect the UK. So there's a good chance that we'll see more frequent sort of wet and windy cyclonic conditions in winter. That's the top panel on the right. And more frequent dry and stable anticyclonic conditions in summer. So we've got some idea of how our climate might change and the sort of weather regimes that we experience might change. So that's one interpretation of what we mean by a conventional scenario. But you'll see that these are the UK CP climate projections based on RCP 8.5, so a technical term, which basically means quite high emissions. Another way of interpreting what we mean by conventional scenarios is to look at the sort of emissions scenarios that are linked in or associated with what we might think about climate policy that ties us in, for example, with the Paris Agreement and the various international negotiations. So what I show on these panels here are at the top, the fossil fuel emissions in the scenarios used to run climate models. And at the bottom, I show the increase in temperature in the big climate models that are forced with these emissions scenarios. The left panel are the most up-to-date ones. The middle panel shows, the right panels here show the forcings that were used to create the UK CP18 climate projections. So they're fundamentally pretty much the same as the newer ones. And what we see is that under the RCP 8.5, that's the red line at the top, we've got emissions of about 100 gigatons of carbon per year of fossil fuel. And that generates a temperature increase of the order of 4.5 degrees above pre-industrial by the end of the century and rising, with quite a big uncertainty range based on the climate models that we've seen. But those aren't predictions of what might happen to emissions. There's experimental devices. There's stories of what could happen at an extreme, extremely high, extremely low. The third working group of IPCC looks more at, not at sort of hypothetical experimental design type scenarios, but at projections based on how economists and so on think that the world might change economically in response to particular climate policies, climate intentions and so on, pledges and targets and so on. And they pull together a range of several hundred projections of how emissions might change with different sets of plausible policies. And then we can see those emissions on the top right of this panel. There's a big range. Some of that range is deliberately based on unrealistic experimental design type scenarios, but just highlight the solid lines in those plots. So for example, this one here, this is the sort of emissions that are expected as an example under current policies, assuming no major improvements in the way we address climate change. And at the bottom, we see the translation of that into climate. And that current policies type story, if you like, we could think of it as that's what happens if we don't do anything more about climate change, comes up with an increase in temperature of about 3 degrees by the end of the century. So there's a big difference between the scenarios we use in experimental design for running climate models, which are then used to produce climate scenarios, and the sorts of scenarios that are perhaps more resonant with international or national climate policy questions about what is actually going to happen. So that's a disconnect. We'll come back to the implications of that in a moment. Third key concept is that what we're following in this project is what's called a storyline-based approach. So we start off by thinking of some plausible consequences, plausible things that might happen, and then we follow through how they might manifest themselves, as far as we're concerned, in weather sea level across the UK. We're distinguishing in the project between what we call transient storylines, which are storylines describing the change between now and the end of the century, and event storylines, which describe how extreme events might change. But that's often a more conventional interpretation of high impact scenarios. But we're going to concentrate in the first instance on this project here about the description of these transient storylines describing change over time, because they're, I think, the ones where there's something different that we can add, we can contribute to the way we use and interpret climate scenarios in the UK. Fourth key point to remember is essentially a sense of perspective. The storylines are, quote unquote, just stories. They must be plausible, but we don't need to get too worried about the fine detail, the second decimal place of what the numbers are. They're stories describing what could plausibly happen. So they have to be realistic and plausible and credible, but we don't need to try and attempt to be too geographically specific about them and too precise about what their actual manifestation is going to be. The second point is that the storylines don't have to cover all possible eventualities, but they just need to be distinctive in terms of what they might do to how climate changes across the UK over the next few decades. So they're distinguished essentially on the basis of their outcomes, but you may get different drivers or different causes producing the same outcome. And we wrap those up in the description of the stories. The fifth key point is how we characterize the plausibility of these different stories, because it's really important that we come up with a description which says why we think these are plausible, why we think the consequences of these are plausible reactions to this particular scenario, and so on, rather than we just made it up. It's more robust than that. And we distinguish between how plausible is the driver or the trigger for that scenario, and how plausible is the response of the system to that scenario. Often they may be different. And we use historical evidence and model evidence and theory thinking to help characterize the plausibility of either the push or the response, if you like, of the system. And the aim is to then characterize those on a relatively straightforward scale, just so we can get some high level indication of how robust and plausible we think these stories and projections are. So here are the 6 headline storylines that we've constructed in the project so far. We've given each a code, and it's got a short title. Some of them are based on a driver outside the quote unquote conventional range. Some of them are based on a response of the system outside the quote unquote conventional range. And one of them is actually a bit of both. It's got several different mechanisms can produce the same outcome. So there are 6. We've followed the same broad approach for all 6. I'm going to just talk about the first 5 at the moment in varying levels of detail. I'm not going to talk in the next few minutes about the sea level rise scenario, but the principles are the same for those. So the first scenario is one where we get more warming than we conventionally think based on conventional scenarios, and I'll expand on that in a moment. The second storyline is where we get accelerated warming because the reduction in aerosols that emitted, particularly in parts of East Asia, is greater than we anticipated. So we therefore get a greater increase in temperature than we anticipate. The third story is one where we get a series of major volcanic eruptions, which introduce, again, aerosols into the atmosphere and have the potential for generating changes in climate over the UK. The difference between the first 3, the first one is quite a long-term thing. We're baked in to a lot of change already because the change in the long-term drivers are already there, the CO2 and so on and so forth. High 2, the aerosol one, is a relatively short-term thing because the response of the climate to change in aerosols is relatively short-term. We're looking out to the 2050s. And similarly, volcanic cooling is a relatively short-term thing, depending on when the volcano goes off. So the timescales in the first 3 are subtly different. The fourth story is one where we see stronger amplification of warming and sea ice loss in the Arctic than we anticipate, or a greater response of the climate system to that increased Arctic temperature, leading to potentially changes to circulation patterns outside the range that we conventionally assume. The fifth story is one where we see more abrupt changes in the ocean circulation in the North Atlantic than we conventionally assume, which leads then to subsequent changes in climate across the UK. And there are a couple of variations on this. One is we call it a high 5A, which is a collapse of the Atlantic meridional ocean circulation, which essentially is the day after tomorrow scenario when the Gulf Stream switches off, essentially. And the second variant is a slightly smaller potential change to the North Atlantic, which again has the potential to impact upon UK weather and climate. So we've got these high-level storylines, each of which we expand upon and describe in terms of some sort of causal loop. So we have the scenario, the storyline in the middle. On the left, we've got the drivers, the reasons why that thing might happen. So in this particular case, number one, enhanced warning, it's because we've got a change in the driver outside our conventional range, or a change in the response outside our conventional range, each of which will produce a large-scale physical climate change, and each of which will manifest in a change in what's going on in UK weather and climate. So I don't want to go into the detail of these in this seminar because there's far too much information here, but that's the approach that we're adopting. We're separating out the problem into stages, and we can look at each stage and work out whether we understand each stage, how plausible each stage is, and so on and so forth. So the enhanced warning scenario, there are three potential mechanisms why we might get more warming than we quote unquote conventionally think. One is that we might have more emissions than we conventionally think. So emissions might be higher than, for example, the IPCC AR Working Group 3 current policies estimate, but there might be some backtracking on commitments. Things might change so that we end up emitting way more than we thought we would. There may be stronger carbon cycle feedbacks in the atmosphere. So as the Earth warms, we may get more methane released from permafrost and so on, which generates more warming. Or the climate may be more sensitive than we think. All of these together would lead to an increase in temperature and an increase in the rate of warming. And this relates to the questions about how we interpret RCP 8.5. And this is quite a live topic at the moment. Working Group 3 of IPCC concluded that these high-end scenarios have become less likely but cannot ruled out. And they say that they do not represent a business as usual projection, but are only useful as high-end, high-risk scenarios. So they're emphasizing that these are relevant for high-end scenarios. Now, they actually say they're only useful as high-end scenarios. I think they're extremely useful as high-end scenarios. So I've highlighted the word in red, and we might have a bit of an argument or discussion about that. But essentially, the RCP 8.5 type projections are increasingly interpreted as being high-end. They represent more emissions than we currently expect, or potentially stronger feedbacks than we potentially expect. So one implication of this is that the scenarios based on RCP 8.5, the global, regional, and local strands, we should perhaps interpret them as high-end scenarios. One argument is that high 1 is UKCP 18 RCP 8.5. There's a caveat here in that we can use this UKCP information in terms of levels of warning, which gets us around this problem to a certain extent. And that begs the question of what we want to do to define a more conventional 4-degree world type scenario. And there are ways we can think about scaling or using the probabilistic strands and so on and so forth, which is a relatively technical matter that we might want to discuss in Q&A. Second scenario is the effect of reduced aerosols, particularly in East Asia, which has the potential for generating increased temperatures globally, but also across the UK through teleconnections, through the way the climate system works, not because the aerosols directly affect the UK, but because they affect some features of the climate system across East Asia, which then knock on through to features of weather across the North Atlantic and the UK. And the way we're addressing these scenarios is basically by using constructing this story is to use some work that has been done in a number of previous projects, and thanks to my colleague Laura Wilcox for providing this information, where they've run some scenarios with different extreme assumptions about what happens to aerosols. Essentially, what do we conventionally assume and what could possibly be the biggest reduction you can expect. And then we're looking at the results of that over the UK window. And as a sort of a quick heads up, it looks like if there was a big reduction in aerosols, then we might get temperatures across the UK about half a degree higher than we anticipate by the 2050s. And that's a not insignificant amount. Third scenario that we're looking at is volcanic cooling. And in a sense, we're following the same sort of approach where we're using results from existing studies which have looked at what's the effect of past or potential future volcanic eruptions on global and UK climate. The effect of a volcanic eruption depends on where it is, how big it is, and to a certain extent when it happens, and the nature of the response of the system. So how the climate system responds to that forcing. So here we see an example of a study which has looked at what happens if we get another Pinatubo-like eruption. And it turns out the worst case, if that were to happen, would be if that eruption would be between winter in the Northern Hemisphere. And that would produce globally a reduction in temperature of about 0.4 degrees for a few months. But in the UK, it might be down to about a reduction of a couple of degrees for about 4 years. So a plausible projection is once we get a volcanic eruption, we get a reduction in UK temperature of up to 2 degrees for up to 4 years, the effect reduces. We could also think of a bigger bang, a bigger volcano, and this is the one that we will probably be using as the core of this scenario, where we get a 3-degree drop across the UK up to 4 years, with the effect reducing over time. And that'd be quite a substantial consequence for the UK, things dependent on UK climate. Incidentally, there's not much obvious effect on precipitation across the UK relative to the large variability we currently experience. Scenario number 4 is what happens if the Arctic amplification effect is stronger. I'm not going to talk about that in any more detail at the moment. I just want to give another example before finishing of the ocean circulation storyline. As I say, there are 2 variations on these stories. One is like the big day after tomorrow Gulf Stream switch off. And there's another one where a bit of the North Atlantic becomes increasingly stratified, so doesn't absorb, so the rate at which heat is absorbed in the ocean changes, and that has a knock-on effect across, in terms of lower sea surface temperatures across Western Europe. And again, we're seeking to characterize that storyline by looking at one particular climate model, which happens to have a particularly big response to this subpolar gyre and the North Atlantic cooling. So 3 models in this particular study found 3 models produced a short-term, well, not short-term, actually, it's reasonably long-term, cooling across the North Atlantic because of the change in the structure of the North Atlantic, of this particular part of the North Atlantic. 3 models out of 30 or so had this response. The most extreme response is in this model here. And if we just cookie cut out the UK window, and thanks to Ben Harvey in the Department of Meteorology for doing this, then we see what would happen to UK temperature. And here I've got the 4 seasons. I'm showing the temperature change relative to now. And what it tells us is that under this story, after temperatures would go up, and then once this effect here to the cooling in the North Atlantic kicks in, temperatures go down, and we find temperatures going down consistently. So by the 10 years after this effect kicks in, then they're cooler than they are at the moment. And we get quite strong changes in rainfall with quite a bit of variability. So wetter in winter, quite a lot drier and colder in summer, warmer and colder in winter. So that's an example of another extreme high-level scenario. So hopefully I've given a flavour of the sorts of scenarios we've been constructing, and importantly, the approach we're using to define and characterise those stories. So I'll give a couple of hints as to what these stories might look like, but hopefully you've got an idea that they're constructed using a logical, clear framework where we can consistently assess plausibility and where the sources of evidence for our characterization of that plausibility come from, and how we can then present these in a way that's consistent and to be used together with other climate projections to estimate the potential high impact consequences in the UK. So 4 quick reflections. One is that this storyline approach is a really powerful way to characterize and define and express our credibility in these plausible high impact scenarios. It's a really, really powerful approach. We're using a blend of observations, models, and particularly theory in order to come up with these plausible stories. Don't take the stories too literally. We can spend ages arguing, talking about the details of a particular high impact story. This is very high level. And finally, there's a bit of an implication for how we use and interpret UK CP18 projections, because in my view, I think the UK CP18 RCP 8.5 projections are best interpreted as high impact scenarios. And that has an implication for what we might think of as a quote unquote normal scenarios. I mean, I think about ways of constructing more credible normal scenarios. The difference between them increases as we go through time. Over the next 30 years, it's relatively small, but I think this project has led us to think a bit about how we use and interpret UK CP18 projections. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. That was thought-provoking. We're getting lots of questions coming into Q&A, so I'm going to hold those. If we could hear from Mike and learn a little bit about the response from the policy and practitioner angle, then we'll go into the Q&A. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, so a couple of thoughts from Environment Agency perspective. Firstly, in terms of the big picture, our national strategy for flood and coastal erosion risk management. So this echoes what Nigel said earlier about preparing for 2 degrees warming, as well as planning for 4 degrees rise in temperatures, and considering that in terms of both mitigation and adaptation. So that's that joins up and aligns with a lot of what Nigel said about that planning for the more extreme end. But probably focus on an area of work that's a bit closer to me. It's a project I lead called long-term investment scenarios. So this is a Environment Agency project where we look at investment needs and outcomes for different levels of investment across the whole of flood and coastal erosion risk management for England. And we do that for a number of different what-if scenarios, and that enables us to consider different potential futures without knowing their likelihood. So aligns quite well with the use of some of these extremes that Nigel has discussed. And this work is really good timing because we've just started a new project to update these scenarios. We're due to publish in 2025. What we typically do is use a range of different climate scenarios based on the allowances that are used in the sort of day job roles of project appraisal and giving advice to planners. But we also want to explore those extremes, to consider that question, what's the worst we need to plan for, and to test the outcomes of different investment levels with those different extremes. So previously within the long-term investment scenarios work, we've used a high plus scenario, as mentioned earlier, but now we've got these wider range of options, particularly where they have these high impacts for rainfall or sea level rise. And on the investment side, they're really interesting in terms of testing to what extent they could change what we invest in, where and when. So does it change the balance of of an investment scenario in the future in terms of the amount of investment in on the asset side, or in natural flood management, or other interventions? Does it change the timing of investments and the profiles? Does it change what we consider to be no regrets investment? That'd be a really interesting question to look at under some of these scenarios. And also, does it change what we think we need to do to ensure capacity to adapt to different potential futures? So coming right back to preparing for 2-degree warming and planning for 4, can we test our investment levels and our plans and the sort of portfolio of activities we might be investing in, and test those against these different scenarios to see what they tell us about our capacity to adapt? That's probably it. That's the range of things that I'm thinking of. And as I said before, the timing's really good. We're just embarking on this new project, so these are live questions for us to be discussing, and I'll be really interested to see what comes up in the Q&A.
Excellent, thanks, Mike. We've got quite a lot of questions in. We're not going to get through all of them, so we'll pick off those that have been upvoted. If you put a question in and we don't get to it, I'm hoping we can persuade our 2 speakers to perhaps have a look at those questions offline afterwards, and we'll try and get those up on the website. So Nigel and Mike, let's have a look at the first of the questions. So the first one, when I sort them into order, is from Fiona. And Fiona's saying, how do we access the scenarios? Is there any guidance on developing local storylines or downscaling the scenarios for use at local scale? Nigel, do you want to pick up on that one, I think?
Yeah, so the scenarios will be described as a series of numbers. They'll be quite high level. Most of them will be national, because there's little evidence how the difference might vary across the UK. There are a couple of exceptions to that. And essentially what we would be doing is providing these scenarios as changes that you could apply to whatever you think of as your standard conventional scenario. There'll be some specific guidance about how to do that in the context of RCV 8.5. But so they'll be provided in numerical form, but very simple as numbers to be added perhaps once per decade to a climate scenario. There's a possibility that some of them we might have a difference between the north and the south, depending on if there's clear evidence that the system the UK will be differently impacted by the story across north to the south. But they certainly won't be provided at the level of detail or in the UK CP18 user portal, for example, even the level of administrative region. They're much coarser than that, given that they're to be interpreted loosely as scenarios rather than taken too numerically and too quantitatively. And I guess you would just then, at the local scale, you could just then apply them to your local information, your local data.
Okay, thanks, Nigel. There's kind of a second question that's very close to this one, so I'll carry on, but Mike might want to come in as well on this one. It's from Robert Nichols, and he's asking for more examples of how you might potentially use the high-end scenarios. So how might this play out in a policy or practitioner decision, for instance?
Well, I think probably Mike start with that one.
Yeah, I'll give that a go. So that's exactly the question on my mind. So previously we've used the high plus plus to test what that does, how it changes. So particularly within the long-term investment scenarios, you change the climate scenario up to an extreme level, such as a high plus plus, and it's made the picture of investment very different. It's made it more black and white, because some of the places where water levels rise, sea levels rise, the risk is higher. It depends whether there's sufficient benefits in that place to raise defences or do more to try and keep up with the climate change. So there's been some really interesting results from trying the high plus plus before. So I think it would vary by the high impact scenario, but assuming they're giving you more rainfall and more sea level rise, and you expect a similar sort of story of making it harder to keep up with climate change, where you're only investing where the benefits are greater than the costs. So it's that economic constraint that we have within the investment scenarios that makes it really interesting.
I was interested that you covered during your response, also looking at the no regret or low regret scenarios across the high end and the more likely range. I think that's an interesting part of it too.
Yes, it will be that. We haven't done that yet. That's something we're planning to do in this new update. So yeah, that's definitely.
And in a sense, in response to the question as well, these scenarios, it provides the opportunity for users to be able to follow some of the CCC principles of good adaptation, but about thinking about the unexpected. It helps support users meeting the DEFRA Green Book guidance on thinking about more extreme scenarios. The question of how you use climate information and when you use high impact and when you use ordinary and what we mean by ordinary is actually, in my mind, is a bit of an open question. It's a bigger question about how you use and interpret climate projections. But what we're doing, hopefully, is providing more information in that mix so that when users do decide that it's important to look at no regrets options or the things that is difficult to reverse and so on, and are very risk averse, then these provide information to help that decision. But the issue about guidance for how you use climate scenarios is a big one.
Great, thanks, Nigel. Next question is more of a technical one, I think, and I must admit it's one I was wondering about during the presentations. It's from Caroline, and she's asking, how might you combine the storylines? And she gives the examples of how might you combine scenario 1 and scenario 6. What does it mean in terms of the credibility and plausibility of the combined scenarios?
Well, essentially, yes, you can conceptually combine them, because you may get an HI1 type story. We've got more warming than you expect. You may get at the same time bigger reduction in aerosols. You may get a volcano going off. You may get higher Arctic amplification because you've got more warming, and you may get a more abrupt ocean circulation change. So you may get them all added at one go, and meanwhile Greenland falls over. So it is plausible to add them up. You would do that, but actually some of them going opposite directions, they'll be inconsistent, but and we'll provide guidance on that. But it relates to how plausible then you interpret those combined scenario stories, and by separating out into bits and by being explicit about how the stories potentially link, then it gives guidance on how to combine them. One of the things I mentioned actually briefly was that each story isn't meant. We're not meant to be going to be completely comprehensive. Almost all of the first 5 stories have a sea level, in principle, have a sea level component. They could all cause an increase in sea level, but they will all be less than the high 6 increase in sea level. So in a sense, that one trumps the other ones in terms of their sea level change. But we will, where feasible, give some indication where we know about potential changes in sea level associated with these stories. But they will be small compared to high 6.
Okay, thank you. The next one is from Mark, and Mark is focusing in on thinking about the observed record, and talks about events that might be observed but fall outside the range of climate scenarios for the current situation and near future. Mark talks about his perception of some extreme events perhaps not being picked up by climate models. What's your view on that? Okay,
so the transient scenarios I've described so far are designed to describe sort of change in a sense seasonal climate over time in a sort of gradual way. That of course is superimposed on weather variability. So as a first approximation, you superimpose this sort of an increased trend due to reduction in aerosols, for example, on the conventional day-to-day, year-to-year climate projections that you use normally, which include extreme events. What I didn't talk about in any detail were the corresponding event scenarios that we're describing, that we're producing, which are essentially seasons or hot, cold events, but not particularly precisely defined. And what we're going to be looking at, see how how the magnitude of these sorts of events might change in association with these stories. The first assumption is that if the whole of the UK is 2 degree warm, half a degree warmer because of aerosols, then the hottest heat wave is half a degree warmer because of the reduced aerosols. But it may be that there are good physical reasons why we might find that the highest, although the average temperature goes up by half degree, the highest temperature during the heat wave goes up by 1 degree. So the event stories are based on these high level stories, but with extra sort of theoretical or where feasible model understanding, which giving us clues as to how individual events, loosely defined, might be changed in association with these stories. So we're not just assuming that everything goes up by the same amount or down by the same amount all the time. And that's particularly the case for the stories that have a bigger impact on circulation regimes.
Thanks, Nigel. I think what was key there as well was that you highlighted the multiple lines of evidence for the storylines. I think that's a feature of all of these that you've produced. It's something we tried to do in High++ for sea level. I think it means we're kind of investigating the problem in different ways, and it means we're able to use evidence that goes beyond the model and takes account of the model limitations as well. I'd also just bring in briefly for Mark's point that when comparing the model and observations, it's really important to make sure we are comparing like with like. So for instance, if we look at the heat wave in the UK last year and exceeding 40 degrees, some models, including some of those in UKCP, can pick up events like that one we saw last summer. But then if you look at other types of models, they won't necessarily see the most extreme temperature or rainfall events. So it's a very nuanced question, and it's one I very much describe as an active area of research as well. Next question. Next one is from Peter Watson. Peter's saying, it seems very good to consider extreme scenarios, but it currently seems quite subjective. What would stop another group coming up with different scenarios? And if they did, this is a part for Mike, how would decision makers know which are best to use? Would it make sense to do something like survey a representative sample of the scientific community to find consensus on what scenarios should be considered? So I think both of you could come in on that one.
Okay, can I come in first? Yes, there is nothing to stop another group of people coming up with a different group of scenarios. We have gone round some consultation and a fair bit of thinking to narrow it down to our selection of 6. In terms of conducting an expert survey to get some form of consensus, well, I think I'd be skeptical about that, partly based on past experience of doing expert surveys on extreme scenarios nearly 20 years ago, when you couldn't get a consensus and the range was huge and it depended on the experts that you consulted. But the point of the approach that we're taking is that it's open and transparent. So it's not subjective. It is based on being very clear about what the various lines of evidence are, being very clear about how we've interpreted it, where the information's come from, and why we think these particular stories are plausible the way they are. And there is absolutely nothing to stop someone else coming up with another plausible and high impact scenario representing some sort of driver that we hadn't thought of, or altering their perception of plausibility because there's some other driver or response in the system that we haven't specifically characterized.
Thanks, Nigel. Mike, I'm going to ask you to pick that one up, but also we're running short of time. So we're going to take one last one that I think is really related as well. So Alejandro asks, in particular, how are EA thinking about storylines? So I think that's kind of related to this user perspective. And he's also going further and saying, do you see storylines to be used as guidance and perhaps an update to climate allowances? Mike, over to you.
Thanks. So the first one, it's an interesting question. I was thinking about also considering what decision it is you're trying to make. So what scenario you choose might depend on what the problem is and what the decision is that you're trying to make. I think the way that these are set out in terms of the drivers and the responses really helps with that. So I like that. In terms of the storylines, so I don't think we've used storylines much or at all within the new long-term investment scenarios. We're actively seeking to use them because there are parts of the analysis that is inherently uncertain, and we want to be able to describe that appropriately, rather than previously we've changed the presentation of results based on levels of uncertainty, but it's sometimes been mixed in terms of how well we understand those uncertainties. This time around, we want to understand them better, and yeah, absolutely. So maybe it will be a good test case pilot situation for us to try storylines. Might be a bit harder in terms of guidance for regular activities. It might be a bit harder, but I think we've got a good place to start with the LTIS work, so we'll give that a go.
Excellent, thanks, Mike. So it's 1 minute to 1. I think that's probably a good point to draw the questions to a close. I'll note one item in the chat from Hazel Jeffrey, highlighting a new EU project that is focusing on tipping points and the use of ESMs that might interest some of the listeners as well. Thank you very much to both of our speakers, and thank you to all those who've asked questions. We will try and answer the ones we haven't been able to get through now. And that's it for the webinar series. Thank you very much, everybody.